Listen Layer allows you to easily track activity across multi-step forms on many of our form listeners. I'm going to walk you through how easy this is to set up. The first step in your Listen Layer account is to navigate to the website screen and ensure that your domain name is properly defined. And then make sure that you've grabbed the tracking script from your Listen Layer account and place that on all pages of your website. In this case, we've created a simple custom HTML tag, pasted our script, and we've set that to fire on all pages. Once that's done, you can either preview your changes or you can go ahead and publish those. Now, taking a look back at Listen Layer, we're going to jump to our listeners library, search for Gravity Forms. We already have this listener enabled. Gravity Forms has a powerful feature that allows you to build multi-step forms, and some of our other form listeners support this as well. For example, Drupal Web Forms also allows for multi-step forms. Since we have this listener turned on, we're going to go ahead and jump to the features section and look at form activity. If you're wanting to track the multi-step functionality, you'll need to enable this feature here called Form Submissions Multi-Step. Once this is enabled, in the events screen, we'll find two events become active. The first one is GF Form Step Change, and the second one is GF Form Steps Submitted. The Form Step Change event is pushed into the data layer every time a user navigates between stages or steps in a form. As that event is pushed into the data layer, the listener also collects details about the user, their location, and the form step, pushes that into the data layer as well. Upon full completion of the form, the event GF Form Steps Submitted is pushed into the data layer. So now that we have the right features enabled, let's go ahead and publish our changes. Then we're going to navigate to our website, which is already connected to our preview. We're going to refresh the preview. And because I just published changes, I might go ahead and do a hard refresh as well. Then on our testing website, we'll navigate to the multi-step form page for Gravity Forms. Now we can see an event has loaded in the console called GF Form Loaded. And this is coming from our form loads feature, which is turned on inside of Listen Layer. So let's go ahead and progress from one step to the next. What you'll see is we now have an event called GF Form Steps Change. And we'll take a look at the debug view to get a better look at this data layer event. So here you can see the GF Form Step Change event is being pushed into the data layer as the user progresses from step 1 to step 2. You can see the form ID is passed, as well as the individual fields and those values, and the actual step number. Now, in certain form listeners, we're able to calculate and determine the step that the user is on. In others, such as the Drupal Web Form module, this is not possible automatically. However, you can write custom rules based on information in the form itself and the location in the URL to easily define the step that the user is on as they progress through the form. And you can do that by writing custom values and pushing those into the data layer. In order to do that, you would need to turn on the custom data layer values feature, which you can learn more about here. So now that we have this event, let's go ahead and copy this. And in Google Tag Manager, we're going to go ahead and create a trigger. This trigger is going to be called a custom event. And we're simply going to paste the name of the form step change event here. And we're going to save that. Now, every time a user moves from one step to another, this trigger is going to fire. And we may also want to grab the actual step of the form. In this case, let's grab the step number completed. So I'm going to copy the property path, and I'm going to go back to Google Tag Manager, and I'm going to create a variable. And I'm going to call this variable step number completed. This is going to be a data layer variable, and I'm going to paste the path. And so now every time Google Tag Manager sees this variable in the data layer, it's going to collect it and make it available for use. So let's say I'm working with GA4, and I want to send a custom event into Google Analytics every single time a user progresses from one step to another step. So we're going to want to send this when the actual step changes. And we may want to just call this step change and define a specific parameter that would be the step number completed. Here, we're going to actually push the value of the step number into the event tag. Now, every time a user progresses from one step to another, we're going to send an event to Google Analytics 4. It's going to be called step change, and we may actually change the wording here in the required syntax. And every time this is sent, we're going to send a parameter, which is essentially a characteristic of this event, into GA4 with the event itself. And we can then build a funnel inside of Google Analytics 4 that would show every single step and the actual drop off between those steps. And you can look that up, how to dig into GA4 and build a funnel based on rules around these custom events. But we're going to go ahead and save this. Oh, I guess we have to have a configuration. In the sample configuration. Of course, you'd want to put in your actual GA4 ID there. And now let's go ahead and continue to move through our form. You can see we have another step change here. And you can see the step number that was just completed is number 2. And now I'm looking at step number 3. And we'll continue through until finally we submit the form. And we have an event here called GF form steps submitted. And so jumping back to our debug view, we're going to grab the event name and we're going to create another trigger. And this also is going to be a custom event, but we're going to call this one multi-step form complete. And in this case, we may want to send a specific event again to GA4. We're going to call this step form complete. Now in this case, we may or may not need to add any parameters on this. In this case, just for simplicity, we're going to leave that off, but you could push in additional values with this actual event, or you could decide to just turn this specific event into a conversion directly in GA4. And we're going to trigger this when the actual steps are completed. So let's refresh our preview and see what we have here. Now, it's always good to debug this because there can be minor elements that are easily forgotten. So in this case, our debug is connected. Let's go ahead and progress from one step to the next. And what we should see is our multi-step event here is being sent to GA4 as the user progresses. And if we switch to look at the values, we can see that along with the event, we're sending this parameter named step number completed and the actual value. So let's do this again. We'll take a look at it again. Here we have the value number 2. And so you can see here now I'm sending events into GA4 for every single step in my form. And I can easily build the funnel and calculate drop-offs between steps. Now, this is focused on a single form on your website. However, this would work across all multi-step forms on your website. You could track all of those together under a single setup, a very basic and centralized setup like I have now. Or you could make it a little bit more complex, adjusting your triggers to focus on a specific form. For example, in our data layer here, recall that the form ID is passed in with every single event. And so if I had 2 or 3 different versions of a multi-step form and I wanted to track them separately, I would simply need to capture this variable into Google Tag Manager and then use it inside of my trigger to modify when a certain event is sent in. Or I could actually send this value as a parameter, an additional parameter, into my multi-step form. So let's take a look at what that would look like. So I'm going to copy the property path of that form ID. And I'm going to define a new variable. Now recall here that we are getting this variable from the data layer. So it's going to be a data layer variable. And we're going to paste the value in. But it looks like I got the wrong value. Okay, so here's the form ID. Now I'm going to modify my tag where I'm sending my events to GA4. I'm going to add in a new parameter called form ID. I'm going to push that form ID that I just created into this. And now if I had 2 or 3 or even more multi-step forms, I could use a single tag to track all the steps of those forms, but dynamically collect the information about the step. And then I could build separate funnels based on form ID. So let's update our preview again. And we will now take a look again at the multi-step forms. And what we should see now is the same tag is firing, but we now have an additional parameter with the value being the actual form ID itself. Now we're just scratching the surface of what you can do with values in the data layer. An additional layer of complexity to this, but also adding a lot of power, is to leverage our custom data layer values and create what's called a lookup table inside of listen layer to start to categorize and add additional characteristics into your tracking activity. All of that will be pushed into the data layer inside the form custom values. So let's proceed through our form and ensure that we have our final tracking event set up correctly. And here we are, we've completed our event or our form, and we're going to look at our steps submitted event. And what we'll see now is we have the steps completed multi-step form GA4. And this was that additional tag that we fired. So this is going to send an additional event to Google Analytics, allowing you to define the actual conversion at the end of the form. Now, it's important to note, again, that all form systems work slightly different. So if you are working with a listener for a different form system, such as Drupal web forms, or any other form system that might have this multi-step functionality, you'll want to thoroughly test the steps of your form and ensure that you're tracking all the way through to the end of that form. And if you're missing a piece of information, such as the step number, it's a result of that form system not supporting our ability to actually get that information. However, you can, again, leverage the custom data layer values to write and manage simple rules inside of Listen Layer that are very powerful, enabling you to segment and capture more enhanced data.